to First Impressions, yet another episode of the podcast where we talk about our love for Jane Austen and give a big middle finger to all those haters. As usual, I'm Kristen, and I am joined by Maggie.
Hello.
Hello, Maggie.
Happy to be here as always, Kristen.
I mean, you have so much to say today after our reread of Northanger Abbey.
Well, I always have a lot to say, but hopefully some of it will be of value this time.
I know you're really charged and pumped up to have reread it and to talk about it again after we went to JASNA, where the theme, if you haven't listened to those episodes, was Northanger Abbey.
After talking about Northanger Abbey for a long weekend without having reread it for a while, I thought, hey, we should reread this book so I can talk about it with actual intelligence.
We really talked about it pretty lightly because we did one episode, which was before we released the podcast, and we kind of outlined some of the interesting things about it, but I don't know that we did a ton of textual interpretation.
No, but I think that we should actually make this a two-parter. I'm just going to say right off the bat.
Yeah, okay, we can do that because this novel, I mean, when you reread it, because I had always considered it kind of more of a minor work. I mean, she takes a little bit of a different tone. It's so comic and, and she's on the theme of novels and writing. So you can almost see her progression as a writer in it. But actually, when you go back and you realize the time she was working in and all the crappy novels she had to read, you realize what an incredible genius she was for such a young age, because this novel is hysterical and the jokes are actually pretty modern.
I thought it was so fun. And I think I was telling you that I actually preferred to read it only a chapter or two at a time, because each one was just this little morsel of goodness to be enjoyed.
You have to hang over every delicious turn of phrase and the delightful jokes and the delightful parodies of people. And it's all around. It's just a delight. It's a mini masterpiece. I'll call it that.
Well, speaking of mini masterpieces, I think we have a new segment to introduce to the podcast.
Yes, we do. So when we were lucky enough to go to JASNA in Williamsburg, I picked up a copy of the Daily Jane Austen, which is A Year of Quotes, which was edited by Devaney Lozer. So that there's a different Austen quote for every day, and they're from all that, there's no rhyme or reason. They're just from all the books and even the juvenilia. And I opened it to November 16th. Today's November 16th, although the podcast probably won't be published for another couple of weeks. And you will not believe, Maggie, guess what book the quote is from?
Is it from Northanger Abbey?
It, in fact, is.
Oh my God!
Coincidence. And not only that, but it dovetails so beautifully with what I want to talk about. So let me just read it. It's a short passage from Northanger Abbey. The speakers are Henry Tilney and Eleanor Tilney, and you'll probably recognize it as when they're on their walk with Catherine in they're actually taking their walk, which the heroine was most unnaturally able to keep. So it starts out, and the first speaker is Henry Tilney. What am I to do? You know what you ought to do. Clear your character handsomely before her. Tell you that you think very highly of the understanding of women. Miss Morland, I think very highly of the understanding of all the women in the world, especially of those, whoever they may be, with whom I happen to be in company. That is not enough. Be more serious. Miss Morland, no one can think more highly of the understanding of women than I do. In my opinion, nature has given them so much that they never find it necessary to use more than half. We shall get nothing serious from him now, Miss Morland. He is not in a sober mood. But I do assure you that he must be entirely misunderstood if he can ever appear to say an unjust thing of any woman at all, or an unkind one of me. Yay!
Yay! So when I was reading this book, every time Henry would say something, I was remembering what you had joked about Kevin, I think, and you joked about this on the podcast.
Yeah.
This is Kristen's husband, where he likes to make misogynistic jokes in front of her, but he does it in an ironic way to point out, in an effort to show how dumb saying misogynistic things is. And I feel like that is Henry. I was like, he's Kevin.
Yeah, Kevin is most like Henry Tilney of all the Austen heroes, for sure.
He really doesn't say things that are serious very often. I find him very charming, and a lot of that has to do with J.J. Field, right? Of course. But
Right.
he was kind of annoying in this for me.
Oh my God. So that it just dovetails perfectly with what I want to talk about. Because I always felt that people who like hadn't seen the movie and who still said that Henry Tilney was their absolute favorite Austen hero, I was always a little surprised by that because certainly for the first half or even, three-quarters of the book, he is a little one note and he's
Hmm.
often just saying satirical things without like a lot of heart or, every once in a while he'll make an observation on how what a good-natured person Catherine is. Even that comes a little bit towards the end of their time in Bath when he's starting to be more interested in her. But yeah, his conversation is so witty, but it's almost like he's in love with his own wit.
Yeah, for sure.
And I always thought that Catherine was enchanted by him just because that kind of wit was so new to her and fascinating to her.
Hmm. I think a lot of it goes over her head, though, to be honest.
Yeah, yeah, she's just puzzled and confused and intrigued by it.
I could see hanging out with Henry Tilney. It's you could do it in small doses, but then after an extended period, I would just be exhausted by him.
Yes,
Do you know what I
so
mean? Speak plainly, sir. Like what is your point, Henry? Like what are you trying to say? I would just get really frustrated, I think, after hanging out with him for a long time when all he does is be sparkling wit.
he's amusing himself. I think he does change by the end of the novel.
Yes.
And I think the novel does not make that explicit. It only really talks about Catherine's evolution. But when you sort of read between the lines or like take a look at his actions, he does change and grow in depth. And Catherine almost teaches him to do that through her, the goodness of her character. The more he is exposed to her way of thinking and being, the more he appreciates it.
And it's like Pride and Prejudice for me in that when I was reading the very end, I'm like, they both changed.
They did, and Austen is not necessarily presented that way. But this is the perfect time. If you don't mind, I am going to talk about, before we got on the podcast, I was reading a lot of critical analysis of Northanger Abbey to sort of enlighten myself to some of this stuff. And I went to JASNA's Persuasions Online, which is it's not a newsletter, it's a peer-reviewed publication now, but it's where people publish essays about Austen and her works. And I came across one by George Justice. Sorry, George
What an
Justice.
amazing name. He should be in a comic book.
I know, a
He's the
husband.
district attorney in like Metropolis or in Gotham. George
Yeah, or
Justice.
or the Austen murder mysteries that you proposed a little while ago.
Yes, he can be the local barrister. Or I guess whatever local nobleman was serving as
Oh, the magistrate or
yeah,
whatever.
the magistrate, George Justice.
George Justice. A little on the nose, don't you think?
Oh my God, we
But
need to write that. We need to write a series of books called the Jane Austen Mysteries.
he wrote this essay in 1998 where he frames the novel as a novel about courtship. And his insights about it are so fascinating. And the first thing he says, which I did not know, is that back in history times, in Austen's time,
In history times?
yeah, my brain like skipped over like late 18th, early 19th. We all know when she lived.
That's fine. History times. Gotcha.
History times. There was something called the courtship novel. So there were Gothic novels, but courtship novels were also about, the heroine being courted. And the book is about a lot of different kinds of bad courtship, none of which is ultimately that successful. Um, but this is so fascinating because Henry brings to the story a kind of courtly wit, where he's almost witty for wit itself, and he sort of exemplifies the hero of a courtship novel. So actually, both of the characters, Catherine and Henry, are main characters from stories written by bad writers. we never necessarily get that explicit send up of Henry and the courtship novel as we get the explicit send up of Catherine and the Gothic novel. But it really shows his hollowness at the beginning of the story. It's only when they sort of break free of the conventions of their respective genres that they become truly in love. And Justice says Austen contrasts proper human relationships by the send-ups of bad convention in literature. And I just love to think of Austen reading all these horrible books and being like, this is so dumb. I could do so much better than this.
That's a really excellent point, that Henry and Catherine are each in their own different genre of book. And then they both kind of figure out, like, hey, I should just be a real person at the end.
They learn to be real people. And Henry, is obsessed by language. So he's an excellent satire on modern language. He's interested in wordplay. And
I'd call it a nice book.
Yeah, Eleanor Tilney even says, you are more nice than wise.
Yeah.
Both of them are more something than they are wise.
But
right?
See, that's just really annoying. It's like when people who do that, when you like misspeak or maybe not use a word of exact precision, or it's like, hey, can I have the remote? Sure, you can have the remote. It's like, Henry, give me the fucking remote. It's like, my meaning was not unclear to you.
Yeah.
That is the point of language. I don't need to say, Henry, may I please have the remote control? You know what I mean? Like, that to me, it's really annoying when people do that. And I feel like at the beginning, Henry Tilney would actually be the bitchy, witty, gay best friend of the heroine.
This is very cool. He was called metrosexual at JASNA. I forget now by who, but they were pointing out he had a lot of feminine interests, like he loves novels.
But couldn't you see him just being like, you don't want to have that be the main character,
exactly.
Because you don't want to overuse that type
kind
of like personality. But he's definitely the gay bitchy best friend of, except he's the love interest. But it's like you were saying, once you grow as a person and break free of that kind of constraints of your genre, you can be a fully realized person. I have to like write a paper.
Oh, I know. And it's so true. And you should write a paper
about Henry Tilney, gay best friend.
Gay best friend. It's not that he doesn't have a sexual intrigue about him, but his vanity is certainly sent up at least several times, including the time when they're on that walk where he's like discoursing on the picturesque, and then he starts talking about enclosures, and it was like, then from there it was a short step to politics, and then the silence. And what I think is so interesting too, from that narrative perspective, I don't know if this struck you at all, Maggie, but there are the passages where the narrator is the confused Gothic novelist who's like, everything's all wrong about this. This is unnatural, writing from the Gothic perspective. But there are so many funny parts which have an Austen-esque narrative style where they're making fun of even real people and their foibles, just like Austen does in the other books.
Mm-hmm. I think most of those places I touched on when the narrator was kind of describing Catherine's viewpoint of things or people, like when they're on the walk and she doesn't know anything about drawing, so Eleanor and Henry are describing what makes for a good view for a picture and stuff. It was something like she looked down at Bath and realized that it would not be good for this beautiful city. It was actually not very good for drawing at all. The sky was far too blue. Like the day was far too fine. It needed to be gray and overcast.
And that's not the perspective of the Gothic novelist. That's the perspective of Austen, the modern satirist of behavior, expectation, and the foibles of people.
Yeah, I think she kind of uses describing Catherine's inner thoughts and feelings to make those type of jokes. Like Catherine herself wouldn't get it as a joke.
Oh, no. Yeah, exactly.
But the reader understands that there's a lot of irony happening here with the way Catherine sees the world.
Yeah, and then there's almost a third narrative mode that gets slipped into when we're hearing the thoughts of Catherine. Like Arnie said at JASNA, the narrative is heavily colored also by what Catherine thinks. So it slips into this sort of language like maybe people weren't always the most agreeable, and
Yeah.
maybe nice men could be disagreeable too. And it's this very as like Socratic as she was described, sort of a mode. So this narrator has such range, and it's always intelligible. We always get the joke, and it's almost switching between modes. Certainly, Isabella Thorpe is never framed in the Gothic context. She's framed in the Austen-esque I'm making fun of people context when it says things like she bid Catherine adieu with the laughing eye of utter despondency.
Yeah,
Right?
she's nothing but a comedic character. And I think the narrator makes fun of her through the whole thing.
Oh yeah.
One of the parts I love, I have so many, I just really liked reading it.
Yeah.
So this whole time, anytime Isabella did anything, I was just thinking like, what a bitch. And the best part was when she, right at the very end, after the engagement with Catherine's brother has broken up, and she writes Catherine the letter at Northanger, and it says basically, please write to your brother on my behalf. I don't understand why he left in such, maybe he has a cold. He seemed in such a state. I think there might have been some confusion, but why don't you clear it up? And Catherine's like, no. And then she's kind of upset about the loss of this friendship because they had been so close. And I love how Henry and Eleanor are basically like, are you upset though? And then Catherine's like, yeah, she was a total bitch. I'm not upset at all. And then that's it. She just like has this moment of realization where it was this toxic friendship. And she's like, no, I'm actually not upset. This is fine.
I think I'm okay with it.
She's a bitch. I'm good.
That's one of the passages where Henry's language changes from like satire to like the language of real feeling. Because at first he's like, of course you feel this way. Of course you feel like you could never go on. And it's like this fake, almost like he's assuming the fake Gothic drama. And then when she was like, you know what? I don't think so. And then he says, you feel what is most of credit to the human nature. And switches back into the Henry who's thinking about and very much aware of the excellencies of her character, as it's put.
She's saying, well, are you sure that you'll be upset? And Catherine said, no, said Catherine after a few moments' reflection. I do not. Ought I? To say the truth, though I am hurt and grieved that I cannot still love her, that I am never to hear from her, perhaps never to see her again, I do not feel so very, very much afflicted as one would have thought. But I also like how he does switch back to being his typical silly self, and he's like, "Oh, she's missed out on such a good sister-in-law. Eleanor, wouldn't you love to have a sister-in-law like Catherine?" And Eleanor's like, "Yeah, that would be great." Henry.
Such a sister-in-law would delight. Yeah, it's such a sweet passage where they do transition into what's fake about Gothic emotion and what's real about their emotion about Catherine.
I think though that he doesn't necessarily think of her that way yet when he makes that joke. But Eleanor is like, yeah, that would be great to have a sister-in-law like Catherine.
Yeah. I don't know how much he's honestly thinking about her. I know at this point that he has been directed to gain her heart, right, by General Tilney.
Which is interesting. Let me ask you this. In the film adaptation, the good one, I was always under the impression that the general wanted to marry Catherine himself.
Really?
And that's why there's a line of dialogue, I think, that Eleanor says when she kicks Catherine out. That made me think that. So he was actually interested in marrying Catherine himself when he thought she was rich. And, well, I mean, in the book, very clearly he means Henry to marry her.
Right.
And in the movie, did you always think it was that he wanted Henry to marry her?
Yes.
Is that your interpretation? Okay, maybe I'm just being completely crazy.
Well, he's always setting up, like he's setting up the country walk or whatever, and then he says, you will excuse me now, right? Or he leaves, and he leaves her with him. And so, I mean, I could see it going either way, and certainly to the practical end, to his idea of marriage. It's very equivalent to him marrying her himself because he's getting her money in his family.
Yeah,
And
that's true.
that's what marriage means to him, right?
Yeah.
So there's certainly a close equivalence between his desire for Catherine and what he would normally think of as a marriage being about.
Yeah, and the book is very explicit that he wanted Henry to marry
Yes.
her.
Yes. Yes.
I just loved her character so much in this. Her arc I thought was so good. It was just really beautifully done. And it was really, we talk about these coming of age stories and things
Yeah.
like that, but it was just really fun to watch her growth and maturity.
When you reread the scene where she tumbles out with all of her suspicions to Henry, what was your reaction? I know when we were having a casual conversation with Deborah Yaffe about the book at JASNA, and we were kind of saying that's not real smart. I mean, when people say that Catherine isn't smart, I think it all focuses around why she would blurt it out to him, but it's become so real to her.
Do you mean when he catches her in his mother's chamber? I don't think she really does tumble it all out, though. He intuits. She just says, she talks about like her dying so suddenly, none of you being at home. I thought maybe, and then he knows where she's going and calls her out on it, but she never says, I thought your dad killed your mom.
No,
but I think she's not capable of artifice. He's like, what are you doing here? Basically, she's not capable of being like, I was just checking out this room because I heard it was cool. Do you know what I mean? Like, she's not a good liar. She's not, she doesn't even know how to do that. She always assumes everyone is a good person. Everyone tells the truth. And actually, what I liked the best is she was ashamed of herself before he even got there. If you read it, she walks into the room. She's built it all up in her head. She walks in, and it's just this really nice, beautiful room. There's sunshine coming in through 2 sash windows. Astonishment and doubt first seized them, and a shortly succeeding ray of common sense added some bitter emotions of shame. So I love that she actually is ashamed of herself before anyone calls her out. She just gets in there.
Which makes it a little bit unusual that she would then still say some of that stuff to Henry.
But again, like she tried to kind of get away without admitting why she was there. Well, first of all, she was very surprised to see him. He's like, "Oh, didn't you know? This is the fastest route." Blah blah. Yeah. Like, no, I didn't know that. I thought it was in the middle. But she's just so incapable of hiding the truth or her emotions that she doesn't really. I mean, they go off on a whole conversation about Isabella writing before they even start talking about. So her only defense is basically to try to distract him, but he's not buying it. He wants to know why she's there. But I don't know. I just really appreciate. I didn't remember that she was ashamed of herself before he chastises her, and I appreciated that.
I appreciate actually now that you have said that. That's actually a really important point, that it's her honesty which forces her out with it, not necessarily her ongoing suspicion or desire to tell him that stuff.
I don't think Catherine Morland ever tells a lie in the entire book.
No, in fact, it says explicitly she could not tell a falsehood even to please Isabella, when Isabella's like, my dear one, wasn't it a delightful afternoon, when they were out driving. Yeah. Which is just, it's interesting that her morality at the center of this story still allows her to conjecture. It's really kind of how Gothic novels have sort of a little bit twisted her, that her like very strong sense of morality, how she normally assumes that other people would behave the same way as herself. And Henry even says how little trouble it can give you to discern other people's motives. And that it's the Gothic literature that gives her the ability to discern other people's motives, but in a very twisted way. She's just a sponge. She's just young and she absorbs everything and sort of is learning about the world by testing hypotheses. And this was just one more hypothesis that she was testing, is like, could this be what I've been reading about? And honestly, when I was 17, 18, I had a lot of wacky, I wasn't like a fully formed thinker. So I think I can forgive her that.
I am going to go out on a limb and I'm going to say that Catherine is actually the most moral. I don't know if moral is the right word. She is the most, quote, good of all the Austen heroines. And I say that because everyone always wants to point to Fanny Price as this like moral Christian bastion, right?
Right.
But Fanny's super judgmental.
Yeah.
And I just think Catherine, I texted you this earlier. To me, Catherine is a young Jane Bennet.
Yes.
She always thinks well of people. She always assumes people are telling the truth and acting rightly. She always wants to do the right thing herself.
It's true, and she does not have Elizabeth's wicked sense of humor. Time will tell whether she develops Henry's or whether she just continues to let him be witty and appreciate that.
Oh, I think that they're actually a great match, and I think it's because she will always be sweet and kind and nice, but she will always laugh at his jokes.
Yeah, she
And
will
if
always
he ever
find
goes
him.
too far, she will be like the moral center for him.
She always gives him honest feedback about what he says. She, you know, like when he's like marriage and dancing are the same, she doesn't go like,
nah,
oh, uh-huh, oh, uh-huh, how interesting, you know.
Yeah, or I see
She,
what you're saying, but I disagree. And I like how if she thinks something is wrong, she stands up for herself. It says like Catherine could also be stubborn.
yes, where
Or
she
like
felt herself to be right.
when they wanted her to lie and
Yeah.
to go out with them, to go to Blaise Castle,
Mhm.
and cancel her plans, she did not give in no matter how much they tried to persuade her. When John Thorpe goes and lies to the Tilneys on her behalf, I would have slapped the shit out of him.
Oh, I know.
That was so rude.
But let me tell you something interesting about that, because I love that you brought that up. Because Thorpe, so I read another essay in Persuasions Online by Ellen Moody, who is an English professor or was at George Mason University. So I knew who she was. Like I used to be on the same listservs with her. She has done a lot of reading of Austen's era and read a lot of Gothic stuff. And what she points out is that Thorpe is a Gothic villain in there are a couple of parallels. And one of those things is how he's always constantly trying to abduct Catherine, lying to get her company when she is in his carriage and she sees the Tilneys and realizes that she's been deceived. And she's shouting, "Stop, stop. What is the description of him? He only laughed, made odd noises, you know, called to his horses to go faster," that kind of thing. It's a very scary moment where she is not in control of her own bodily autonomy. It's like a Gothic abduction in a parallel to it.
Well, I think what Jane Austen is doing right is she's taking these things that typically happen in Gothic novels and just using them, but in a real life way.
Yes. Well, Moody goes a step farther and she says, look, Gothic novels in their time were about the violence of men towards women.
Mm-hmm.
And while they may seem unnaturally drawn, are not out of the realm of anecdotes that women might have heard about men being abusive. There was, I looked this up in Unbecoming Conjunctions, which is J. Height Stevenson's book or collection of essays. And there was a neighbor of Jane Austen called Lord Portsmouth, who was actually educated by Jane Austen's father in his school that he was running, right, for young boys, who was a sadist. Mm-hmm. And it was right in her neighborhood, and it was well known. He tortured animals. He had a servant who had a broken leg, and he went in and re-broke the guy's leg while it was healing. I mean, he was a monster. And so while she had at least one actual example of someone being as evil as the Gothic hero could be, she wanted to bring it back to like how people act in real life, but it wasn't so unusual to say that Catherine was wrong to believe that General Tilney could act in an evil way. I mean, they did have lots of real life examples, and that's why Gothic novels resonated with young women in the first place, or, you know, in general.
Right. So you're not necessarily going to fall in with a handsome highwayman who murders and steals and abducts you to a castle, but you might actually end up talking to a jerk who will lie to you.
Yeah.
And not
even
stop
low-key abduct you. Like, wasn't it? Violence against women was not out of the realm of possibility. But Catherine also lives this pastoral, idyllic life where at one point Isabella says, "Oh, the men are shocking." And Catherine says, "Well, they've always behaved very well towards me."
Mm-hmm.
And it's this Gothic novel that introduces the idea that men can be violent towards women.
Right. No, I agree.
Sorry.
Sorry, I don't have anything
I'm a
exciting to
freight
say
train.
after that. I just agreed.
But do you, I mean, when you are with Catherine at Northanger Abbey, do you, I think it's shown that her suspicion of General Tilney is coming from a real seed of her knowledge, her new knowledge that men can be violent towards women.
I guess I think she also observes him being so controlling. If
Yes.
not physically abusive, then manipulative and controlling, which I see as a form of like emotional abuse.
Huh.
So so we talked about this a little at JASNA and I think on our last podcast, but to me, there is a Gothic heroine, but it's not Catherine, it's
Right.
Eleanor. She
Right.
really is.
She's been abducted in a way.
Yeah, she's this poor girl, mother died,
Isn't.
huge house, left trapped there basically. If not trapped, if not explicitly by her father, then by the societal conventions, which do not allow her to go out into the world as she wants to. Um, Very little company. I mean, before Catherine comes to visit her, Henry's only there like what, 4 days a week? So
Yeah.
it's just her and her dad, like stuck in this big rambling abbey.
Well, you're absolutely right. And that tone of her, when we think of her with him essentially imprisoned in her house, that hits a Gothic note, doesn't it?
Yeah. And they're
And
so happy when the general leaves.
I know
So
they're so,
sad.
they're
They're like,
freed from all
oh,
restraints.
finally, we have
The
such a great
movie,
time.
the movie does a really good job of capturing that too.
Yeah, we can eat when we want. We can walk where we want. We're no longer constrained. They have so much more freedom to enjoy their friendship. And before she gets kicked out the day before, and I think they do this just to make it. Austen does this to make the Catherine's abrupt leaving is very much of a shock to the reader. Is that she, said wants to broach to Eleanor, well, maybe it's time for me to leave. She didn't want to leave, but politeness dictates that after a month stay, perhaps I should offer. And Eleanor's like, oh, no, please don't leave me. But it made it so sad to me that she was so desperate to have Catherine stay.
It's weird how this is a total tangent. I love that scene, but in their language, it seems that in Austen's day, they were allowed to be more blunt with each other than we would be comfortable with today. Like Eleanor says, she thought a much longer visit had been promised. She was misled, perhaps by her wishes. So she does soften it. But to say I was misled to your friend, even though it is softened by, oh, perhaps I was misled, and then parenthetical, perhaps by my wishes, right? To even say that kind of a thing or to oppose, I think you were just allowed because conversation was the only thing that you had, to have a little opposition for the sake of talking about something, right?
I think what we're trying to get around is civil discourse
That's still allowed for
because
opposition.
language was so formal and people's baseline was total civility and politeness. You can have conversations about things like that without as much worry of giving offense. Although I know Catherine was worried about giving offense. But the point is, when you do have formal language, you can say things like this, and it's presented in a way that it's not going to devolve into. You don't need to worry about Catherine
Yeah,
and
hurt
Eleanor
feelings.
screaming at each other.
No, that's true. Well, and Eleanor's so much better at it, probably maybe because of Henry's influence or natural, I don't know. But when you contrast Catherine's speech to Eleanor's speech, Catherine interrupts her when she's in the middle of a speech about something very different and
Yeah.
says, "Oh, I think I must go away." And Eleanor expresses her concern in this sort of high-flown language. And then Catherine says, "Oh, because I have been here so long." And she's not using the formal language
Mm-hmm.
of, we're doing this delicate dance of civility. She's just speaking from the heart. And then Eleanor says, nay, if you can use such a word, and which is another thing where they're focusing very much on the language and what her underlying feelings might be and deducing that from language, whereas Catherine is just going to tell you.
Right.
Like,
But
she'll tell
also,
you.
like, you don't, if there is a misunderstanding, it will be corrected through just like polite conversation.
Yeah. Well, how much did you love the passage where the Catherine and the Henry Tilney at the opera, where he comes after he's been slighted by her?
Okay. So you're talking about where John Thorpe told Catherine that the walk with the Tilneys was off. But
Yes.
then she passed them and they're like, WTF, where are you going? And so
Yes.
they think that she just like stood them up and didn't care. So then they give her the cold shoulder. There's a lot of misunderstandings there. They
At
give
the
her, she
opera.
thinks they're giving them like the very cold shoulder.
Yes.
Um,
And Austen goes into the Gothic phase where she's like, instead of being offended on her own behalf that anyone could think she's done anything rude or immoral, instead of being the proud, cold, having been insulted Gothic heroine who allows them to discover the misunderstanding by chance, she just wants to go and tell them how sorry she is. And then when Henry comes to her, she explains himself and she's like, why were you less generous than your sister? He's like, what are you talking about? I could have no right to be offended. And she's like, no one would have thought you had no right who had seen your face. And so she is also getting at the emotion that he felt underneath this courtly, behavior, this courtly dance,
Well,
right?
maybe he doesn't also want to admit that a 17-year-old not going to
No, of
walk
course
with
not.
him
Of course
actually
not.
hurt
He's
his
not going to
feelings.
admit his real feelings about
But see,
that.
this
Yeah.
is why I love Catherine, and I think, well, I mean, I also do this too. But if she messes up or feels like she's offended you, it tears her up, and she can't
Yeah.
stand the idea. It's such a likable characteristic of
Yes.
hers, and she has to put it right, and she has to explain herself, and I just think it's adorable.
I do this too, man. It
I do
just
it
like
too.
absolutely just destroys me. And then half the time they're like, "What are you talking about?"
Well, I once got an email from a friend who's like, "You said this thing, and I didn't feel comfortable with you saying that to me," and I immediately started bawling.
Oh no.
And Bay's like, "What's wrong?" And I'm like, "So and so's mad at me. I said something. Oh my God, I have to explain myself." And so I like wrote her back immediately and was like, "But I was continuing our conversation. Like, I'm so sorry. Please forgive me. Blah blah." And I've always told people that if you have a problem with if I've done something, just please tell me.
Because I am never intending to hurt you. And that's the thing that really bothers me about some relationships where if you go to somebody and tell them that they've hurt you, you are the monster for implying that they could possibly have done anything wrong. And it's, because you got upset, it's your fault. Everything's your
I'm
fault.
sorry you were offended. That
Yeah, I'm
kind
sorry
of
you were offended.
non-apology. Yeah. I
And
think, yeah, but for me, it's just I don't like it when people hold grudges.
no, I'd rather just know, right?
Can we just talk it out? And if it's not, if like something happens and you don't want to be friends with me anymore, that's fine. But just tell me.
Right. And
Do someone the courtesy of telling. But people, and this, I was also going to make this point earlier when you were talking about how people back then seemed more open about talking about things. People now are so afraid of confrontation because it
yes,
can devolve
right.
that people are afraid to have these kind of are afraid to tell each other these things. It's like, well,
Right.
I'd rather just sit here in misery and be unhappy than actually tell you what's bothering me. I don't understand that mindset.
I'd rather vent and like to all my friends about how much I hate you. And like,
Yeah.
Why can't you just do normal things like talking behind my back at the like
Yeah.
in Bridesmaid?
Or Kathy Griffin, where she makes the joke like, I talk about people behind their back. It's called manners.
But then things never come out, and then things never get resolved, and then it's a problem for sure. Absolutely.
I like to. My brother is such a non-confrontational guy that he'll just like sit somewhere and be I could say it's his like being Midwestern because there's such a like strong desire to not rock the boat, not cause trouble. I'll just live in my misery rather than chance bothering someone.
Yeah.
So at the restaurant, I'll ask a server for more ketchup, and he's like, "What are you doing? It's so embarrassing."
Oh my
And I'm like,
God.
"Well, I want more ketchup." And he's like, I think he said this to me once. He was like, "You're supposed to just sit there and want it and not get it like a normal person."
Once I convinced Kevin, I talked him into getting a massage because he was sore or whatever, and he came back. He was like, "I hated it," and I was like, "Why?" And he's like, "It hurts so bad." And I was like, "You're supposed to tell them."
They did the same thing, Kristen. Oh my god.
Is
We
it
got
like they didn't want to like seem that they couldn't take it? Was it like a masculine pride thing?
no, we got a couples massage, and I'm like, "Oh, that was so relaxing." And he's like, "Oh, I was actually very uncomfortable. It was too rough." And I said, "Why didn't you say something? Say less pressure." But his response, it was not that it was a masculine thing. He's like, "Well, I didn't want to make them feel bad
Oh, right.
or bother them."
Right.
You're literally paying this
Yes.
person
Right.
to touch your body. I said, they want you to enjoy it.
No,
If you enjoy it, you won't go back and spend more money.
I can't laugh at them too much because I have student employees
Well,
now.
I know that you're not big on confrontation either, Kristen.
Well, I know it's yes, that is true, but here's how bad I am. I have student employees and they do their homework at the desk, which is fine. That's what they're allowed to do. But if I have a project for them, I will approach them and I'll be like, "Do you think you would have
Oh, no.
time?"
Oh, God. Oh, you're the worst. The passive aggressiveness of it is the worst.
I can't understand. They're always like, "Yeah, of course." They're always like so willing, like, "This is the deal. I work for you." And I always feel like this guilt about even ask them to do anything. I
See,
know.
that's one of the reasons why I like Catherine is because I don't want to say blunt because that makes it sound like it's rude, but she's never afraid to speak up, I guess. And if
Right.
she messes up, she apologizes and feels awful and wants to make it right. But she's not going to not say what she wants.
I know.
Would
And
you agree?
I would agree, and how mortified was she when she realized that Mr. Allen thinks that going out in a carriage with a guy is
An open carriage.
an open carriage is not appropriate. And she says to Mrs. Allen, "Why didn't you tell me that? I would always want to know if you think I'm doing something wrong." And so she's not really meaning to reproach her, but she's just so horrified by the situation. She's, she needs to express it in some way. Like, how could you have not told me that I was
Oh, well,
doing
Mrs. Allen's the worst.
Austen is
She's the ultimate
brutal.
people pleaser though, isn't she? Where she just like says whatever she wants just to like go along with what the person she's talking to wants.
Oh, it's so true. And I even love the caricature of her and Mrs. Thorpe just talking over each other, and they don't want to listen to each other. They just want to talk, which is hysterical. And even the time when Catherine is like, "Oh no, it's gonna rain," when Miss Tilney is gonna come, and she keeps asking Mrs. Allen what she thinks, and Mrs. Allen's like, "I'm sure it'll be a very fine day if only the clouds will go off and the sun
Yeah.
will come out." And then later she's like, "Oh, it's raining just as I thought." And then later she's like, "Well, anyone would have thought it would have been a fine day." And like, it's just like, as you said, an act of good temper and silliness, just silliness.
I don't know. I just really enjoyed Catherine. I think that she would be cool to be friends with.
Yes, and I wasn't very kind to her in our first
Yeah. Called her dumb. She's not dumb.
episode. No, she's not.
Oh, speaking of which, let me read one of the passages I really enjoyed. Speaking about Catherine being dumb, she's not dumb, and they're talking about reading. Let me find this part. So they're having a conversation. This might be on their walk. They're talking about what they all like to read. And Catherine is talking about how she mostly reads novels. And he's saying, "Well, don't you like history?" And she's like, "Well, no. History, real solemn history, I cannot be interested in." And Eleanor is like, "Oh, okay, well, I like history." And Catherine says, "I wish I were too. I read it a little as a duty, but it tells me nothing that does not either vex or weary me. The quarrels of popes and kings, with wars or pestilences in every page, The men also good for nothing, and hardly any women at all. It is very tiresome, and yet I often think it odd that it should be so dull, for a great deal of it must be invention. The speeches that are put into the heroes' mouths are thoughts and designs. The chief of all this must be invention, and invention is what delights me in other books. So, Catherine does not like reading about history, not because she's not interested in history, but because she knows that the history she's reading is incredibly biased, is mostly made up,
Right.
is not accurate, and is weighted heavily with a patriarchal view. And so she would not understand what I'm talking about, but she stumbles into like actual historical analysis of historical documents by accident. She's like, well, I don't like this thing because it's not well done.
She points out the bias. She's
I know,
woke.
it's amazing.
Catherine is woke.
I was like, holy shit, when I was reading it. Especially,
you're absolutely right.
Especially the men also good for nothing and hardly any women at all.
And she can certainly distinguish fact from fiction when she's reading history.
Right. And so I bet if she actually read real history, she would not have that reaction to it. She just doesn't want to read English history at the time, which was just completely biased and, the winners write the history.
Right.
I don't know. I love that passage.
That is a great passage. I love that observation. It would never have occurred to me. I was going to ask you something on another tangent to go back to the idea of Eleanor Tilney being the Gothic heroine.
Okay.
Is there a hint of Gothicness in Elizabeth Bennet's mother trying to sell her off, essentially, and marry her for money?
No.
It's far more prosaic than that.
Mrs. Bennet is a comedic character. Well, first of all, she doesn't actually, okay, so if she was Gothic, she would be cruel. Okay, here's the thing. She is cruel. Her cruelty would be overt. Her selling off her daughters would be literal. Gothic novels, to me, are very literal. Mrs. Bennet's cruelty, Mr. Bennet's cruelty, Mrs. Bennet's greed, but it comes from her wanting them to be taken care of, like her actual sense of survival. Yeah, it doesn't come from her, like Miss General Tilney is a perfect example of actually being a Gothic parent, I think, because he is emotionally abusive. He is literally trying to get his son to marry someone for her, you know what I mean? For her money. Mm-hmm. I don't see any Gothic in either of the Bennets because they're not even foibles, because it's stronger than foibles. Their negative personality traits come from a place of realness and a more critique of the society that Jane Austen was living in.
Is Anne Elliot a proto-Gothic heroine? Because her mother is dead. So she's checked that one off the list.
I feel Anne is more of a tragic character. Not to say that a Gothic heroine can't also be tragic, but again, these other books, and even Northanger Abbey, are so grounded in reality. I think to be Gothic, it's a hyper-real world. The people's villains are actual mustache-twirling villains.
Right.
Evil, yeah, like literally, right? Evil is actual overt evil. The evil of Jane Austen's other books and the tragedy of her other characters are much more grounded in real life events and possibilities. So I see Anne Elliot. She's definitely I don't see any of the Gothic in the other books. Right. If that's what we're going for. And that's just my interpretation.
No, I see what you're saying, but in the spirit of like, oh, I've identified a Gothic heroine and it's Eleanor Tilney, she's not necessarily actually being portrayed. It's just the parallels between her life story and what a
Yeah.
Gothic heroine's life story would be. Like,
She ticks more
mother
of the
dying,
boxes.
controlling father, her will is thwarted, she's kept in a place she doesn't want to be. And, Anne's will is thwarted by her family, and she's sort of forced to go to Bath against her will. So in the tragicness of Anne, I was just wondering, because we've analyzed Northanger Abbey from the Gothic, I was
Yes,
just
but
wondering if it.
there's a false assumption here. I'm not saying you because we know other people make it, and we will talk about it when we talk about the 1980s version of the film. Northanger Abbey is not a Gothic novel.
No, no.
Right. And so that Eleanor Tilney kind of ticks Gothic heroine boxes, but she's not a Gothic heroine because she's not in a Gothic story. Nobody in Jane Austen's books, I think, you have to be in a Gothic story to be a Gothic heroine. But that is why I so enjoyed Catherine's journey, because she keeps trying to find the Gothic in the real world.
Yeah, right.
But she's not in a Gothic novel.
No,
girl, you're not a Gothic. You're not in a Gothic novel. You are in a novel, but to you, you're in the real world. So there's these little elements, which is why it's satire, right? Because she so
Right.
badly wants to be a Gothic heroine, but you're in the real world, baby.
Right.
Sorry.
No, but if Austen takes art by taking Gothic things and making them then real, and what would happen if this Gothic scenario was real? So I was just wondering if anything like translated to the Gothic twist, essentially, like
Now,
the Austen-esque twist on the Gothic situation.
Right. So, for example, if you wanted to make Anne Elliot, to me, to have her be more of like a Gothic heroine, and this is also drawing on kind of fairy tale tropes, but her mother dies, her sister and her father are cruel and spoiled, which they are. But if they had made Anne Elliot like a Cinderella, then we could, if she had been acting like a servant, if she had to sleep in the servants' quarters, if they'd forced her to wait on them, if she was not given the privileges of an equal family member in terms of wealth and status, now we're getting more into a kind of Gothic. But for her, it's just sad that she's surrounded by cruel people.
She is mistreated by her family, and that's why I think Gothic's taking Austen is taking like the Gothic style of mistreatment and saying this is not realistic. Mistreatment actually looks like this.
Yeah.
And sort of saying that I see what you're saying.
What would be very interesting to study, I think, is why the Gothic novel became the mainstay that it was. And I think I know the answer. I think it's because to make sense of the everyday cruelties and hardship of life around people, it was easier to confront it in fiction with the extreme version.
Yeah, making it very exaggerated.
Yeah.
Having George slay the dragon, right? The menace all around you is a catharsis, right?
Right. Where no matter how horrible things are, it's like, well, at least I'm not
right. At least I'm not penned up in like this evil villain's basement. The Watsons.
Or beset on by highwaymen and taken against my will. Yeah, exactly.
The Watsons, as that little fragment, has one of the sisters, Penelope, I think is her name, thwarted in marrying the man she loves by the other sister who is jealous, putting out some lie. I've read it once, so I could be getting the details slightly wrong. But the idea of someone being so evil and just duplicitous that they're actually sinking the character of one of their family members by spreading lies, that also strikes me as sort of a Gothic way to go.
Yeah, that's very juicy.
It's also very juicy.
Soap opera-ish, right? Very soap opera-ish.
Right. Was there anything you highlighted that I didn't give you a chance to talk about?
Sure. Let's talk a little bit about, and really it's just an excuse to read this fun passage where Jane Austen, within Northanger Abbey, is able to give a big middle finger to everyone who says that novels are a waste of time. It starts where the narrator is talking about how Catherine and Isabella like very quickly became great friends, and they would read together if the weather was terrible and they couldn't go outside. They would basically just hang out and read novels together. And then she goes off, yes, novels, for I will not adopt that ungenerous and impolitic custom so common with novel writers of degrading by their contemptuous censure the very performances to the number of which they are themselves adding. Where I guess what would happen is you'd be a novel author would be like, yes, I know this is just a stupid novel, and kind of disparage their own book. But she specifically says, I'm not going to do that. Let us leave it to the review. Let us leave it to the reviewers to abuse such effusions of fancy at their leisure, and over every new novel to talk in threadbare strains of the trash with which the press now groans. And she basically just goes on to be like, yeah, novels are great. Don't be ashamed for reading them. And now, had the same young lady been engaged with a volume of The Spectator instead of such a work, how proudly would she have produced the book and told its name, though the chances must be against her being occupied by any part of that voluminous publication, of which either the matter or manner would not disgust a young person of taste. So if you're reading a book, you're embarrassed by it. And the books that you would proudly hold out as reading are actually not interesting, not doing anything for your mind. So why be ashamed of what you like reading?
No, and I think it's really interesting where she's like, novels talk about the realness of human experience in the best chosen language, because while she's here parodying Gothic bad literary conventions, she is uplifting general novels, not just her own, but novels in general up to a higher plane by saying there's some really good writing out there.
Well, she's basically agreeing with the mission statement of our podcast.
Yeah, she is. And sort of trying to, as we're saying, like Edgeworth and Burney and everybody putting out these stories called a moral tale or a little book or a little work. Man, call it a novel, because novels are awesome.
Yeah, but I do want to contrast. Now, that's in the very beginning, when Catherine is firmly in the I love novels, I love Gothic stuff phase. And I just want to contrast that with the end, after Catherine has been on this whole, her whole arc of self-awareness and understanding of the world around us. And Austen writes, charming as were all Mrs. Radcliffe's works, and charming even as were the works of all her imitators, it was not in them, perhaps, that human nature, at least in the Midland counties of England, was to be looked for. In the central part of England, there was surely some security for the existence even of a wife not beloved, in the laws of the land and the manners of the age. Murder was not tolerated, servants were not slaves, and neither poison nor sleeping potions to be procured like rhubarb from every druggist. Among the Alps and Pyrenees, perhaps there were no mixed characters. There, such as were not as spotless an angel might have the dispositions of a fiend. But in England it was not so. Among the English, she believed, in their hearts and habits, there was a general though unequal mixture of good and bad. So guess what? Catherine has come to the realization that everyone has some good and some bad. It's the choices we make. She's basically Harry Potter. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk.
No, it's true, but I think it's so Henry. It's Henry's little speech about we are English that makes her draw this distinction between English people. I mean, it's his influence coming in over her.
But also, she's smart enough to know that she doesn't have any experience as to what people are like in the Alps and the Pyrenees. So maybe in these exotic lands, there are actually...
Listen, it's an open question. Yeah,
I'm not going to speculate. I'm not going to speculate without any knowledge on what people are like in the Alps and the Pyrenees. However, in my experience here in England, people are good and bad.
It's sort of this like very English suspicion against the French, isn't it? And she's also brought into, I think,
funny.
I know, it's so funny. And it's also brought into John Thorpe saying that Radcliffe, I believe, married an immigrant. He's like, she married an immigrant. Once I heard that, I knew what kind of stuff it had to be.
Dick. He's just like such a horrible person.
Right. He's a terrible, yeah, exactly. An old man playing a seesaw. I don't know. I've never read Sir Charles Grandison. Maybe I should pick it up. With regard
on that too, where she's like, what does her having married an immigrant have to do with it? She's just like, I don't understand why you're saying this to me. She doesn't understand like this racist joke he's making.
And he's also, I'm sure this is not the intent, because like racism is not even like it framed in the same way in Austen's time necessarily, but he also says that Mr. Allen is rich as
As a Jew.
as a Jew. There's like anti-Semitism in there too. He's just a xenophobe, which also does not speak well to his character at all. And I love the narrator. This critique, the justness of which was lost on poor Catherine. Like,
yeah,
it's just so.
But I promise you that those are Austen is very precise in her language. Those two specific xenophobic examples are purposeful, and they are meant for us to not like him 100%.
It's really interesting. I mean, certainly in Evelina, when I read that, there was a strong anti-Semitism in there, which is not great.
Yeah. Well, two things. First of all, the xenophobia is meant to make him unlikable, and also, I guess, what you would call boorishness.
Yes.
The way that he talks like that in front of her is also meant for you. I mean, he says "damn" all the time, and it's got the line drawn through it because you couldn't actually write that. It's so unacceptable to swear. She can't put it in the novel.
Yeah.
And so everything that John Thorpe says is intended to make him not likable to the reader.
Yeah. In the Austen herself, I'll just add this to be a completist, but for people who don't know, she had French relations. She had a French cousin who she was very close to. So,
but didn't everybody in England, weren't they all related to people? I mean, come on, the Norman invasion was in 1066. Everyone in France and England was related if you go far enough back.
Oh man, you know so much more about history than I do. The Norman invasion. I couldn't have even told you what it was.
Oh, well, see, let me tell you. This actually came up the other day. It was a plot in something that we were watching, the Norman invasion of England, and I started babbling. Bay was like, "The what?" And I'm like, "Bay, Battle of Hastings. Come on." And he's like, "What are you talking about?" And the reason why I've always pinged on it is my grandmother's phone number, the last 4 digits were 1067. And so the way I always remembered it was that it was 1 year off of the Norman invasion. I'm just a big nerd, you guys. William the Conqueror, Battle of Hastings. Don't people just know this? No, they don't. I'm just a big nerd. Also, I had an older brother and he loved English history. So.
Well, on that note.
Well, that was a big tangent. I'm so sorry. If you want, I'd be happy to tell you the history of Williamsburg again.
Always a delight, always a joy to hear your historical. Maggie has a history degree, so she's doing much better than I am. On that note, should we sort of leave it here and transition to the wheat sheaf?
Yes, but I would like to talk more about this book if we could. Do you think that here's what we'll do. Let us, at our next meeting, discuss the movie from the 1980s.
Yes.
And that will allow us to discuss the book more as well.
Yes, I can't wait to talk about this BBC adaptation.
I am not looking forward to watching it.
It's a barrel of laughs. You are going to find it hysterical and wacky and weird. There's a saxophone solo. I mean, it's just wacky as heck. And so it's a delight. I mean, it's delightful.
Will it pair best with white or red?
Oh, a white. Okay. Not even a question.
Okay.
So shall we go to the wheat sheaf?
What's in the wheat sheaf?
Several things are in the wheat sheaf. Do you know?
What? Why are you laughing at me?
It's just what's in the wheat sheaf? You sang it. I don't know. It was funny. Yeah, we always said we need a theme song, so you've.
No, I don't know. I think it should be more like, go down to the wheat sheaf. Go down to the wheat sheaf. Kristen, what's in the wheat sheaf?
Did we already talk about Eugénie's article that we posted on Facebook about how the 5 Bennet daughters represent the stages of grief?
Wow, I don't remember talking about this at all.
Yes, so if you haven't, if you weren't on the Facebook page when we posted this, Eugénie, our listener, wrote this fascinating article about Mr. Bennet.
Interesting. So is Lydia when you denial, maybe? Interesting.
I don't know if I want to spoil the whole article.
Okay, don't spoil it. But I'm like, my mind is feverishly. First of all, I'm trying to remember the stages of grief.
Yeah. So Jane Bennet represents like denial, right? A uniform,
It cannot
cheerful.
be so.
Yeah, right. And Elizabeth would represent anger. She's certainly angry about the state of her parents' marriage. And then depression and acceptance. So it's like Kitty is sort of a disappointment, and Lydia is just sort of acceptance of her insane behavior. He's like, I can't deal with this anymore. I just accept the situation.
Huh.
Um, and Mary's bargaining. She's saying Mary might have been at the stage where he was trying to negotiate his marriage and see if he could make it better. But I thought it was really interesting. And although obviously, Jane Austen wouldn't have been aware of the theory of the 5 stages of grief, I just really liked the lens. I enjoyed the article. It is published at the Jane Austen Literacy Foundation in issue 60, and it's called Domestic Happiness Overthrown, Mr. Bennet and the 5 Stages of Grief. So I'm sure if you just Googled Mr. Bennet 5 Stages of Grief, it would pop right up.
That is really interesting. I don't necessarily ping on it intuitively myself, but I'm willing to be convinced
Yeah, it's
by
just
reading it.
a fun lens to sort of
Yeah.
look at it
Or
through.
maybe even like the way we view human experience in general, not just grief.
And so let me see what else we have got, because I just clicked away from the stupid thing right when I was supposed to be. Oh, yeah. So we heard from someone who was at JASNA, but we did not meet her, Agnes.
Oh no, Agnes, we missed you.
And we sort of characterized Jasna as very academic, but she just wanted to put it on record that there are many people who have given breakout sessions and special interest sessions in the past who are not academics, but just people who love Jane Austen. So,
Oh yeah.
oh,
I didn't mean to imply that to do so you had to be an academic, but I did feel that the topics
and a lot
were
of the
more
people
academic in nature.
were academics. So, but just wanted to get that on record.
Thank you, Agnes. Next time, say
Yeah.
hi.
And we also recently heard from Anna, who I haven't written back to yet because I am a troll who just cannot get my act together. But thank you so much, Anna, for adding your enthusiasm and enjoying us on your commute. And she says our discussion on Mansfield Park made her appreciate the novel in a way she quite frankly did not at all before she listened to it. So I count that as
this is a victory.
Now I can die happy. Like my mission in life has been fulfilled.
Yes, this is Kristen's entire reason for living. Is to spread the good word. She just goes to ding dong. Hello, my name is Kristen. Have you read Mansfield Park?
Have you heard the good news about Mansfield Park?
Do you have a minute to talk about Mansfield Park?
I know it. And I don't think we yet talked about Emer. I'm hoping I'm saying your name right. Who wrote to ask us about our opinion of the Paltrow Northam version of Emma, the adaptation of Emma. Because while we did a movie commentary, we did not necessarily do a normal episode review of it. So that might be something we'll do in the future. We've also had many requests, and I apologize we still haven't gotten to it, to review the Davies Sense and Sensibility from 2008. So that is on our docket for sure.
Oh yeah, I remember that one. These all came out in that same 6-month period.
Yeah, they were doing.
On PBS.
That was the plan.
Them
they
out.
were
every novel.
Cranking them out. Yeah. So some better than others.
I think that one's more difficult to get your hands on a copy.
No, it's on. You can get it on. I mean, you have to pay for it, but it's on Prime.
Can't. It's not like streaming or rent. You have to purchase it, right?
I think you can rent it, but I'm not sure.
But when I remember last time I looked for it, it was before streaming options were so widely available. Because that's only been in the past couple years that it's really Amazon's just basically made everything able. If you pay money, you can stream it now.
We also had several requests to watch the 1970s adaptation of Emma, and I have to admit, never having seen a single scene of it. So we'll have to put that on our docket as well.
Maybe if we ever do like a Patreon or something like that, we could make that an extra.
You're gonna ask us. You're gonna ask people to pay us to watch that adaptation.
Yes, because it sounds shitty.
Yeah, it does. Oh my God.
I mean, we probably will never do that, but I'm just saying, like, do you know which one adaptation I haven't watched in so long? Is the Laurence Olivier Pride and Prejudice. I haven't seen it since high school.
Still have never seen it.
That one we do need to watch.
It's a gap in my education for sure.
Oh, it's going to be crazy, though, with those, like, Gone with the Wind costumes they had left over.
I heard that was a myth.
I don't know if it's a myth, but this is why everybody thinks that Jane Austen's a Victorian author, because they kept doing adaptations where they put people in Victorian clothes.
Right. And by the way, I'll just add that I bought the 2005 reprint of Pride and Prejudice from 1897 that Hugh Thompson illustrated.
Yes.
And it has his illustrations, and it also has illustrated first letters of the chapters. You know how the first letter of the first word is really big? And it has been such an incredible delight that I strongly recommend. It's by like Dover Press or something, and it's a 2005 reprint. And the only thing that disappoints me is the cover. It is not the peacock cover, but everything else is the faithful reproduction. And I found an ebook of Mansfield Park that Hugh Thompson did, but it does not have the first letter illustrated. That I know. I was really looking forward to those. But
anyway. I loved the pictures you've shared of those. Oh, yeah. They're so cute.
Yeah. I should share more since it's not under copyright.
Hey.
Yeah. So anything else to add?
No, just a big thanks to everyone who writes into us. We always do love reading your emails and messages. It's always so fun. It makes us feel like we're not shouting into the void.
Yeah, and that people actually enjoy this. We passed 30,000 downloads, which is hard to wrap my mind around. So thanks.
Bay told me that I should be sure to make an announcement that if we have any German listeners, you should please send us a message. Was it firstimpressionspodcast@gmail.com?
That's correct.
Because he and I will be in Germany for almost 3 weeks in December. And he's like, you should do a message and we can meet up with someone. And I looked at him and I said, what if they're crazy? That sounds like a good way to get murdered. And he goes, what are you talking about? And I said, I'm a woman. We don't just meet people that we see on the internet. But we did at JASNA and everything worked out great. So, listeners, if you happen to live in Germany, drop us a message. And maybe you can meet me and Bay while we're traveling around your lovely country. We're doing a big loop and going through most of the major cities. So send us a message and maybe we'll see you. He speaks German, too. If you're not great at speaking English, Bay speaks German. So there you go.
So he can translate for you.
And I'll just shove beer and schnitzel into my face.
You guys are going to have an awesome time. I'm really excited for you.
I hope so. Okay, Kristen, what do we say?
We have delighted you long enough.
Bye.